I can remember the first time I watched the TV show Roots. I cried, which is crazy because I never cry from movies or TV shows. I actually used to think I was a sociopath because of that, but Roots proved me wrong. It's the story of Kunta Kinte being taken from his home to a place he knew nothing about, his continued fight for freedom, and his legacy that continues on until today. I know nothing about my family history, but I do know that the worst part is knowing that the exploitation of human beings still continues on to this day. It's just in a more masked form with a different name. I've personally never been to prison. I have a few family members that have, but I've never really been that close to them. For me, this is not just a personal story of redemption against the prison system. I just have heard about the topic and I've done some research on it. And I know it's important in terms of shaping the future of our country. People like Bryan Stevenson also care about shaping the future of our country, which is why he gives speeches like this. While it does have a lot to do with systematic racism and institutional oppression, it's beyond that. It's about the human experience and empathy. This speech exemplifies the ways in which slavery didn't actually end in 1865 like we were taught to believe. It still impacts so many people today. Bryan Stevenson, a man that has dedicated his life to solving this problem, discusses and proposes solutions for this injustice. First, let's discuss how this problem is not actually a new one. To put it simply, mass incarceration is a form of modern day slavery. The 13th Amendment has a loophole in it that allows someone to be a slave if they've been convicted of a crime. According to this context, all prisoners are slaves. The 13th Amendment explicitly states, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States, or any other place subject to their jurisdiction. Most inmates are in private prisons, and private prisons are a big business. Prisons make a huge profit off of the free labor of the slaves. That's why, instead of designing facilities to help and rehabilitate people, so much money, time, and effort is put into these prisons. According to the Sentencing Project, the private prison industry is a $4.8 billion business. Slavery was also a very big and profitable business. When slavery ended, the South didn't have access to the slaves to rely on anymore, so they found a way to continue using them for profit without having to pay them. By implementing things like black codes and criminalizing black people for simple things like standing around or not having a job, they found a way to continue using them as slaves. When someone becomes a prisoner and enters into the prison system and they're forced to do work for free, they are a slave. And this is being perpetuated on a mass scale. Even though this is a huge systematic problem, it is more than just the numbers. It impacts so many people in this country. The highest population of inmates are black. According to NBC News, while black people only make up about 13% of the United States population, including male and female, they're about 59% of the prison population. The victims are poor communities of color. While these neighborhoods are continuing to struggle, they're not being helped. Parents and children are being thrown into jail and exploited. This sense of fear that is being generated surrounding communities of color and over-policing only lets the cycle continue going. Luckily, we have people like Bryan Stevenson that are willing to fight for this issue. Bryan Stevenson talks about this issue and why we need to address it. According to Bryan Stevenson's biography on the faculty page of the NYU Law School, he graduated from Harvard with a master's degree in public policy and a JD from the School of Law. He immediately found his passion for representing capital defendants and death row prisoners in the Deep South. In 1989, he became director of the Equal Justice Initiative, where he was able to focus on criminal justice reform. His selflessness can be seen in this speech. In his TED Talk, he talks about the reality of the injustice within the justice system and how the black male population is at the forefront of this issue. As you will see, his words don't just present the problem, he talks about what we need to do to continue moving forward. This country is very different today than it was 40 years ago. In 1979, there were 300,000 people in jails and prisons. Today, there are 2.3 million. The United States now has the highest rate of incarceration in the world. We have 7 million people on probation and parole, and mass incarceration, in my judgment, has fundamentally changed our world. In poor communities, in communities of color, there is this despair. There is this hopelessness that is being shaped by these outcomes. 1 out of 3 black men between the ages of 18 and 30 is in jail, in prison, on probation, or parole. Our system isn't just being shaped in these ways that seem to be distorting around race, they're also distorted by poverty. We have a system of justice in this country that treats you much better if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent. Wealth, not culpability, shapes outcomes. And yet, we seem to be very comfortable. The politics of fear and anger have made us believe that these are problems that are not our problems. We've been disconnected. And yet, we have in this country this dynamic where we really don't like to talk about our problems. We don't like to talk about our history. And because of that, we really haven't understood what it's meant to do the things we've done historically. We're constantly running into each other. We're constantly creating tensions and conflicts. We have a hard time talking about race. I believe it's because we are unwilling to commit ourselves to a process of truth and reconciliation. In South Africa, people understood that we couldn't overcome apartheid without a commitment to truth and reconciliation. In Rwanda, even after the genocide, there was this commitment, but in this country, we haven't done that. And yet, in this country, in the states of the Old South, we execute people. When you're 11 times more likely to get the death penalty if the victim is white than if the victim is black, 22 times more likely to get it if the defendant is black and the victim is white, in the very states where there are buried in the ground the bodies of people who were lynched, and yet there is this disconnect. I believe that despite the fact that it is so dramatic and so beautiful and so inspiring and so stimulating, we will ultimately not be judged by our technology. We won't be judged by our design. We won't be judged by our intellect and reason. Ultimately, you judge the character of our society, not by how they treat the rich and the powerful and the privileged, but by how they treat the poor, the condemned, and the incarcerated. Because it's in that nexus that we actually begin to understand truly profound things about who we are. As you can see, so many human beings in America are still bound by the remnants of slavery, and it's a huge problem that impacts millions of people. In Bryan Stevenson's speech, he addresses how we need to fix this problem. Pretending not to see a problem makes you a part of the problem. The statistics are clear and the evidence is there. Poor people of color are not more ghetto and more deserving to be locked up. This ignores so many factors that have created these ghetto and violent environments. The system isn't broken. It's working perfectly for what we created it to do. Instead, the system needs to be broken.